Have you ever heard a sound that didn't belong to the night? Not a coyote, not a gust of wind, but something wet? As if the world itself was crying into a pool it had long forgotten. And would you go check? Even if no one else would? Even if the silence begged you not to? Cal Mercer didn't expect anything unusual that night. The desert outpost had been quiet for weeks. Ever since the last research team packed up and abandoned the facility, the entire grid had gone dark. He liked it that way: silence, routine, solitude. Most nights he worked late, tinkering with solar routers or water reclamation tanks. He'd hum an old tune, half remembered from a past life, as his tools clinked against metal. But that night, around 2:17 a.m., a sound broke through the static of stillness. It wasn't much, just a splash, quick, muffled, but wrong. There was no running water here, no animals big enough to fall in, and the test pool, the deep one behind the compound, had been dry since the last storm blew through. Except, what if it wasn't? Cal stood slowly from his bench, fingers tightening around a rusted flashlight. He clicked it on. The beam flickered, steadied. Outside, the sand shifted gently underfoot. The wind smelled faintly of copper and ozone. As he moved past the storage bunkers, the temperature dipped. Not just cold, wrong, like air that had forgotten how to breathe. He reached the pool, stopped, and froze. In the moonlight, the water shimmered unnaturally. It hadn't rained. The filtration pipes had long since corroded. Yet the pool, once a dry concrete basin, was filled halfway. The surface rippled. At the center, a shape struggled weakly against the weight of the liquid. Small. Too small to be human. Cal's breath hitched. He ran, dropped the flashlight, leapt the railing. The water was freezing like liquid nitrogen licking his skin. He gasped as his muscles seized, but he kept moving. Reached out. Hands touched something slick. Software, like skin, but not. He pulled. It coughed, gurgled, twitched in his arms. He climbed out, the shape clutched to his chest, heart pounding louder than the wind. On the pool's edge, under moonlight, he got his first good look. She was no older than 7, maybe 8 in Earth years. Her limbs were delicate, too thin, her skin a pale, iridescent blue that shimmered faintly under the light. She had faint ridges along her neck, gill-like perhaps, and her hair clung to her face like seaweed spun from silver thread. Her eyes opened. They were not human eyes, deep, endless, galaxies swirling behind trembling pupils. She blinked, then flinched, tried to crawl away. "No," Cal said softly, kneeling. "You're okay. You're safe." She didn't understand. Of course she didn't. She coughed again. Thin, clear mucus spilled from her lips, then evaporated into mist. Cal took off his jacket, wrapped her in it, lifted her gently. He didn't question what she was, not then. The only question that mattered was who would leave a child, alien or not, to drown alone in the middle of nowhere. Back inside, he placed her on the cot, fetched a heat lamp, blankets, water. She wouldn't drink, wouldn't speak, but her eyes never left him. Cal sat beside her, waiting. She didn't cry, didn't plead, just watched. And in her silence, Cal felt something settle in his chest, something heavier than fear, a promise. He didn't know who she was, why she was there, how she survived. But one thing was certain: whoever left her in that pool expected her to die, and she didn't, because he was there, and he wasn't done saving her yet. Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and realized they had no name to hold on to, no label, no history? Just silence wrapped in skin, begging someone to see them, not as a mystery, but as a person. The shack was quiet that morning, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Cal Mercer moved about the room with an odd precision, careful not to disturb the silence. Not out of fear, but reverence, like he'd accidentally stumbled into something sacred and was still trying to decide whether to light a candle or run for the hills. The girl, because she was a girl, despite her odd coloring and the luminous pulse under her skin, sat curled under 2 thermal blankets. She hadn't spoken, hadn't moved much since he'd laid her down hours ago, but she watched him. Every step, every breath, like she was memorizing him or judging him. Cal didn't mind. He was used to scrutiny. He just never expected it from a pair of eyes that shimmered like liquid stars. He poured a mug of synth tea and set it beside her. No reaction. He knelt, held out his hand. "Cal," he said slowly, pointing to himself. "My name. Cal." She blinked once, then looked at his hand as if it were some kind of riddle. She didn't take it, didn't run either. Cal sat down on the floor beside her. He waited. Time passed differently inside that room. It wasn't until the 3rd hour that she moved, just her fingers, delicate, tapered. They reached into the dust along the cot's edge and began to draw. Not with a tool, just her fingertip, lines, curves. Then a swirl, like a whirlpool surrounded by dots. Cal leaned closer. "Is that water?" She paused, then repeated the motion. Slower this time. The whirlpool, the dots, then a second symbol, a jagged line through it. "Broken?" he asked softly. "Blocked?" She didn't answer, but she stopped drawing. Her fingers curled into a fist. Cal looked at the symbols again. Something stirred in the back of his mind. Old research logs, tech manuals from the aquatic development teams that had once used this station. He stood, rummaged through a crate, and pulled out a tablet from 10 years ago. Cracked, but functional. Swiped through archives until he found the old Deep System symbology interface. He held it up. The screen lit with a series of glyphs, some familiar, some forgotten. She reacted instantly. Sat up, pointed to one, then another. Not random, selected. Her finger paused on a single glyph that resembled a wave, the ancient word for birth. Cal's heart thudded. "You're from the deep-born colonies?" No reaction. He tried another. "Do you remember a name?" She blinked slowly, then touched her chest, paused, her hand hovered, then curled again, empty. She had no name, not anymore. Cal exhaled, long, heavy, then stood and grabbed a chalk stub from the windowsill. He turned to the clean panel wall and wrote one word in large, careful letters. N-I-A. He pointed to it. Then to her. "Nia," he said gently. "It means water. Life." She stared, eyes wide, then looked back down and for the first time, smiled. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there, and that was enough. Cal nodded once. "Hello, Nia," he said, and somehow in that simple moment everything shifted. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She wasn't just a lost thing pulled from forgotten water. They were something else now. Beginning. What would you say to someone who doesn't speak your language, yet somehow understands your fears better than the people who do? Could you learn to talk without words, and listen with more than ears? The days that followed were slow and strange. Not in a bad way, not in the anxious, edge-of-your-seat kind of strange, but in the quiet, unraveling kind. Like watching frost melt from the edges of a long-forgotten window, revealing colors behind glass you didn't realize had been painted. Cal adjusted to Nia's presence the way a man adjusts to a new limb he never knew he'd lost. With surprise, with occasional clumsiness, but also with a growing sense of rightness. She didn't speak. Still. But that didn't mean she wasn't communicating. Every morning, she sat cross-legged in the patch of sun that came through the eastern window. There, with bits of charcoal, wire, or scrap cloth, she'd draw patterns on the concrete floor. Cal started keeping a journal of the symbols. Some were clearly decorative, swirls and stars, loops with rhythm, but others repeated, structured, glyphs that matched old aquatic research symbols, once used by the deep-borne colonies for recording energy flows in submerged environments. One morning, Cal found her staring intently at the water recycler unit, not just watching, listening. He stood behind her, silent, as she placed one palm on the tank's housing. It hummed faintly. Naya closed her eyes. Her fingers twitched. Then she stepped back and reached for a scrap of copper foil, etched into it with her fingernail a precise triangle wrapped in spirals. She held it out. Cal took it, examined it, then it clicked. She'd mapped the water flow pattern in the system, from input to waste loop. Perfectly. He looked at her. "How did you—" She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes said it clearly. She listens in ways you don't. Later that week, she began humming. Not songs, tones rising, falling, soft and even. And every time she hummed near the hydro grid terminal, the readout shifted. Not drastically, but the pulses became smoother, cleaner. Cal tested the unit. There was no malfunction. The only explanation: she was tuning the water or something inside it. And then one night, just before dusk, she stood near the back wall of the shack, staring at the dried-up pipe that once fed the test pool. She placed both hands against the wall and began to hum again, this time deeper, resonant. Cal froze. He didn't know why. But something in that sound, low and vast and filled with loss, reached into his spine and made it still. The air shifted. Dust floated upward. The floor vibrated softly under his feet. And then, a slow trickle. From the pipe. Water, real water. Not synthetic, not recycled. It shimmered faintly, like moonlight caught in glass, and filled a shallow groove along the floor. Nia knelt beside it, dipped her hand, then looked at him. Not smiling, but calm, as if she was home. Cal said nothing, just walked over, knelt beside her. Together they watched the water flow. He didn't ask where it came from. He didn't need to. Whatever force lived inside her wasn't just about survival. It was restoration, memory, perhaps even healing. That night, he wrote only one sentence in his journal. She remembers the water. Have you ever walked outside and felt, before you saw or heard anything, that someone had been there, that the air had changed, that the land itself remembered the weight of unfamiliar footsteps? Cal Mercer wasn't a man easily spooked. He'd spent years alone on the fringe, working in backwater outposts where the rule of law was more of a suggestion than a structure. He'd seen things break, machines, men, even stars from old orbital crashes, and knew the signs of trouble. But the moment he stepped outside that morning, he knew something was wrong. The wind had shifted. Not just in direction, but in tone. It whistled too evenly across the shack's corner, as if funneling through something recently moved. He crouched near the recycler panel. Tracks. Not his, not Nia's. 3 sets, boots, military grade, narrow heel prints typical of bounty gear. He followed them as far as the perimeter sensor zone. The old alarm grid hadn't triggered, which meant they had tech to dampen motion detection. He cursed under his breath. Turned, went back inside. Nia was at the far wall, humming to a pool of water she'd shaped into a perfect ring. She didn't hear him enter, but when she finally looked up, she knew something had changed. She stood, stilled, eyes wide. He didn't need to say anything. They both moved. Fast. He grabbed the emergency gear, ration packs, cloaks, power cells, and stuffed them into the canvas sack. He handed her a tracker node, shaped like a pendant, then opened the trapdoor under the supply bench. She hesitated. Cal knelt beside her. "Naya, you remember what I told you, right?" She nodded slowly. "If I ever tell you to hide, you follow this tunnel to the junction hub. Stay there until I come for you." She touched his hand, fingers soft, trembling. Then she slipped down into the crawl space, disappearing like mist into shadow. He closed the hatch, secured the locks, then turned toward the door. The knock came 5 minutes later. Polite, too polite. Cal didn't answer. The door opened anyway. 3 figures entered, armored, visors opaque, suits gleaming with desert dust. The lead held a data pad and a badge Cal didn't recognize. Likely private contractors, the kind that pretended to work for governments. "Calvin Mercer," the leader said. Not a question. Cal remained silent. "You've been off-grid for over 4 years. No reported activity. And yet," he gestured behind him, "local scanners picked up a thermal surge near this facility last week, and biological traces inconsistent with human origin." Still, Cal said nothing. The second officer stepped closer. "You harboring an off-world asset?" Cal finally spoke. "You got a warrant?" The leader smirked. "Your kind always clings to outdated laws. My kind. Sentimentals. The ones who think they can save every stray they find." Cal's voice dropped. "Sometimes strays are the only ones worth saving." The third agent moved toward the trapdoor. Cal stepped between them. "We're done here," he said. But they weren't. The second officer grabbed his arm. Tight. That was a mistake. Cal moved fast, dropped his weight, twisted, sent the man sprawling. Then reached under the desk and hit the emergency pulse. The shack lit up with white light, temporary blind, enough time. He dove out the side exit, ran around the shack to the hidden vent tunnel, popped the cover. Nia was there, waiting. They didn't speak, just ran, out into the canyons, away from the facility. The agents would find the shack empty, but they wouldn't know the tunnels, wouldn't know the quiet places Cal had mapped years ago when silence had been his only companion. They stopped only when the sun reached its peak. Nia turned to him, panting. She didn't cry, but her eyes burned. He knelt beside her, wiped her cheek with a sleeve. "They'll come back," she said. Her first full sentence, clear, resonant, not afraid. Cal didn't flinch. "I know," he whispered, then added, "But next time, we won't just run." Have you ever heard a sound so strange and beautiful? It didn't just give you goosebumps. It made the world around you stop, like even the rocks and dust wanted to listen. What if that sound came not from an instrument, but from a child who should never have survived? The hideout was a storage shaft buried under an old mining station, half collapsed and sealed off years ago when the funding dried up and the drones moved on. Cal remembered it from his mapping days. Nobody came out here anymore, not even scavengers. The solar activity made the sensors glitch, and most figured it wasn't worth the hike. That made it the perfect place for them. He and Nia had set up camp in the 3rd sublevel, far beneath the crust where the wind couldn't howl and the stars couldn't see. Days passed, then a week. The agents didn't return, but Cal knew they would, and they wouldn't come alone next time. Nia didn't ask questions, but she watched, always watching. She moved differently now, less like prey, more like something waiting to remember what it used to be. And then it happened. On the 12th night. Cal had drifted off, boots still on, his body aching from rewiring the solar grid. The emergency node had to stay functional. If not, they'd lose heat, or worse, water control. But something woke him. Not movement, not light, sound, low, melodic. Not a song in the human sense. No chorus, no rhyme. It was a tone, long, fluid, resonating through the walls like an ancient string pulled tight across the bones of the world. He sat up. Nia stood in the center of the chamber, eyes closed, arms outstretched. The pool she'd formed earlier, gathered drop by drop from filtered runoff, now glowed faintly at her feet. The sound came from her, not her mouth, not exactly. It echoed from her chest, her being, the way whales once called across oceans, only softer, more layered. She moved her hand, the pitch shifted, the water responded, rippling, lifting, forming shapes, not crude, not chaotic. Language. She was speaking to the water, or through it. Cal rose slowly, approaching as if one wrong step would break the spell. He reached the edge of the pool, watched. The liquid rose into columns, spirals, petals of translucent energy. Images formed. A tower beneath an ocean. A people with hair like kelp and eyes like stars. A temple broken by machines. Flashes of war. A ship. Then, falling. Crashing. Nia's voice cracked. The images wavered. She sank to her knees, breath ragged. The song stopped, but the meaning lingered in the air. Cal knelt beside her, laid a hand on her back. "You remember now," he said gently. She nodded, slow, heavy. "They made me forget," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, dry. "But water remembers everything." Cal swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "You're not just one of them," he said. "You're the last of them." She looked up, eyes full of ocean storms. "I was their keeper, the youngest, the one they hid before the machines came." She touched her pendant. "The song is the key." Cal stared into the glowing pool. "What does it unlock?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she whispered a single word in her own language. He didn't understand it, but the water did. It pulsed once, then stilled. Nia leaned against him, exhausted, but alive, and awakened. Whatever she had been before, the lost girl, the frightened eyes in the pool, she was no longer that, and whatever came next. Cal knew it wasn't just about running anymore, it was about returning. Have you ever seen a predator hesitate? Not out of confusion or strategy, but because it felt something old, something it couldn't explain. And what if that predator wasn't made of flesh, but steel, circuits, and algorithms built only to hunt? The tremors came at dawn, not natural ones. Cal had lived through quakes before. He knew the difference between tectonic groans and mechanical thunder. This was controlled, rhythmic, a pattern of metal on stone. Nia stirred before he even reached the surface ladder. She stood by the wall, eyes wide, not afraid, but alert. The pool she'd sung to days before had already vanished, absorbed back into the soil as if hiding its own secret. Cal climbed the narrow shaft and reached the outer passage just in time to see it breach the canyon wall. Not a man, not a team, but a retriever. Six-legged, low-slung, moving like a hunting spider with the bulk of a transport tank. Its carapace gleamed dull gray, scratched by wind but still lethal. Its optics scanned the canyon like burning coals. Cal ducked low. His heart pounded. He knew this model, remote deployed, no pilots, no remorse, programmed to seek high-value assets, living or dead, and it was moving toward their shelter. He slid back down. Nia was already packing. No words passed between them. They had practiced this. But as he reached for the cloak to throw over her shoulders, she touched his wrist. "No," she said. He turned. She met his gaze. "I need to try." "Try what?" She stepped past him. "Let me show it who I am." Cal grabbed her shoulder. "Nia, I remember now," she said. "They made me forget. But I was born to do more than run." She walked toward the access ramp. He followed. At the tunnel mouth, they saw the retriever again. Closer now, scanning with a soft whine, its plasma rifle already extended. Then Nia did something Cal would never forget. She stepped forward, barefoot, no armor, no shield, and began to hum. It started soft, low as breath on glass. The air quivered. The retriever's optic array flickered. She raised her voice. The hum became layered. Harmonics blooming outward, vibrating across frequencies no human ear could fully track. The canyon echoed. The retriever took one step forward, then stopped. Its limbs twitched, not with precision, but like it was confused. Naya lifted both hands now, palms glowing faintly blue. She sang, not a melody, but a tone of memory, of oceans, of deep systems pulsing beneath forgotten worlds. The retriever shuddered, sank. One leg folded, then another. Its sensors sparked wildly, blinking red, then white, then black. With a final exhale of smoke, it collapsed. Silent, dead. Cal stared, his mouth dry. Naya turned, her voice quiet again. "I didn't destroy it," she said. "I reminded it." "Of what?" Cal asked. She walked to him. To be still. To listen. He fell to his knees, not from weakness, from something deeper, a kind of awe. This girl, the one he found gasping in a test pool, had just silenced a war machine built to wipe out her kind. With a song. She knelt beside him, touched his shoulder. "We're not meant to fight with fire," she said. "We were meant to cool it." Cal looked into her eyes, and for the first time in his life, he believed in peace as a weapon. When someone gives you the chance to leave everything behind, to step into a future brighter, stranger, and freer than anything you've ever known, would you take it? Or would you stay behind for the ghosts who never asked you to wait? It had been 3 days since Nia silenced the retriever. 3 days of sky so still it felt like the desert held its breath. 3 days without drones, agents, or the sound of distant scanning pulses. Just Cal, Nia, and a silence that now hummed with possibility. They had made their way to an old comms outpost buried in the basin of the Rasker Cliffs. Abandoned since the solar storms, it still held one functioning deep space array. Cal had salvaged enough parts over the years to patch it together. Just in case. This was just in case. Naya had known it the moment she saw the tower, even in its broken state. Her fingers moved across the terminal with a grace no human technician could match. Her voice unlocked protocols buried in alien code. She wasn't just signaling someone. She was summoning. Cal stood behind her, hands deep in his coat pockets, watching the night horizon glow faintly with old auroras. A side effect of deep-wave transmissions. That, and the taste of copper on the wind. "She'll hear it," Naya said, voice soft. "Who?" Cal asked. "My mother." Cal turned sharply. "You said the machines took your people. They did. But not all of us died. Some escaped, scattered. She was one of them. And she'll come? She'll feel the song." He didn't speak for a long time, just stared at the stars. Later that night, Nia sat beside him outside the shelter. The stars above weren't as cold as usual. Maybe it was the afterglow of her song still warming the air. Maybe it was something else. "She'll want to take me back," Naya said. "To our home, to what's left of it." "You should go," Cal replied. "You belong with your people." Nia looked down. "And you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at his hands, calloused, scarred, human. "I never belonged much of anywhere," he said. "Spent most of my life fixing broken things. Sometimes machines, sometimes people. Never figured I'd get to fix both at once." "You didn't fix me." "No," he smiled gently. "You fixed yourself. I just made sure no one stopped you." The silence stretched again. Then, on the 4th day, the sky split. Not violently, but like a curtain drawn back. A vessel descended, unlike anything Cal had ever seen. It shimmered with translucent arcs, like a living shell spun from light and memory. Naya stood. Tears didn't fall from her eyes, but her breath caught. As the ship landed, a figure emerged, tall, regal, with the same glowing skin and star eyes. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Mother. Cal stepped back, letting them embrace. He should have felt joy, relief, but something in his chest ached. The woman looked at him and nodded. Not a thank you, not even recognition. Respect. Nia turned, held out her hand. Come with us, she said. Cal blinked. Nia, you don't belong to this dust, not anymore. He hesitated. The air between them hummed with more than memory. She didn't plead, she just waited. And Cal realized something then. He wasn't being rescued, he was being invited. Not because he was needed, but because he was wanted. He took her hand, and the stars opened. They say the stars change you. That once you leave the gravity of the place you were born, you never quite come back the same. But for Cal Mercer, it wasn't the stars that changed him. It was the sound of a frightened girl gasping for air in a forgotten pool, and the song that followed after. The vessel rose slowly from the canyon basin, silent as breath, smooth as a tide rolling backward into the sky. Inside, the cabin was nothing like the ships Cal had seen in his past life. No clunky metal, no flickering wires. This was alive, fluid. The walls pulsed gently with light like a heartbeat, and the seats molded to their forms as if remembering who they were before they sat down. Naya stood at the center console. Not operating it exactly, more like communing with it. Her fingers hovered above glowing panels and her hum, so familiar now, murmured in resonance with the ship's movements. Her mother stood nearby, eyes steady on the stars ahead. She hadn't spoken a word to Cal since they left, but her presence wasn't cold. It was old, measured, like the sea watching a single wave and waiting to see if it would return. Cal sat by the viewport, hands on his knees, watching Earth shrink behind them. So many years spent scraping oil from his skin, eating recycled proteins in silence, fixing broken systems for people who never looked twice at the man behind the tools. He never thought he'd leave, never thought he deserved to. But now, here he was, drifting through silence not born of loneliness, but of purpose. The ship moved through layers of space he didn't have words for. Not faster than light, but deeper. Like folding reality back on itself. Like slipping into the memory of the universe rather than its path. They arrived at a place that wasn't a place. A reef of energy spirals, floating among broken moons and shimmering fields of stardust. There, hidden between time and void, was the deep-born sanctuary. He saw it. Curved spires grown from coral stone and memory glass, suspended in mid-space as if breathing. Pools of living water connected each level, glowing from within. Other deep-born moved like liquid through the architecture, their bodies bending light, their songs vibrating across the air without needing sound. And they saw Nia. They felt her. And they came, one by one, touching her hand, her face, her shoulder. They weren't just greeting her, they were welcoming her home. Cal stepped back, unsure where to go. He didn't want to interrupt. Until one of them, a small boy, maybe 6 or 7 by human guess, walked up to him and smiled. "You're the one who jumped," the boy said. Cal blinked. "What?" "The song told us. You jumped into the water." Cal chuckled quietly. "Yeah, I guess I did. It wasn't safe." "No," Cal said. "But she was." The boy nodded solemnly. "That matters." Later, Cal found himself in a chamber with Naya, her mother, and a pool unlike the others. This one didn't reflect faces, it reflected futures, memories not yet lived. He saw flickers of places he'd never been, languages he'd never spoken, faces that seemed somehow familiar, though he'd never known them. Nia stood beside him. "Everything you did," she said softly, "was meant to end here. I didn't know where here was. You do now." He looked at her, at the woman who had been a scared, drowning child, at the girl who had rebuilt herself one song at a time, at the alien who had become somehow family. "Do I belong?" he asked. Nia didn't answer. She just reached into the pool and sang. The surface rippled, and for the first time Cal heard his own voice echoed back, not as it was, but as it could be, whole, rooted, remembered. He knelt beside her, closed his eyes, and let the water wash away the final pieces of the man he used to be. He wasn't lost anymore. He had leapt, not just into water, but into meaning, into memory, into a place where no name had been written for him until now. And if you listen closely, sometimes on still nights, when the wind cuts sideways and the stars hang heavy, you might hear the story whispered, not in words but in hums that ripple through water and stone. The story of the man who dove into the pool to save an alien girl, and found a home among the stars instead. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, if it made you remember something lost or imagine something new, leave a comment. We read them all. Every voice, like every ripple, matters.